My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes as I gasped for air during a brutal asthma attack, holding my inhaler just inches from my hand and whispering, "Breathe, old man," while my own son stood frozen doing nothing. And in that moment, on the cold kitchen floor, I realized something was terribly wrong in my own home, and that the people I trusted most might not care whether I lived or died, and what none of them knew was that a silent camera had been recording everything that happened that night, capturing every cruel smile, every ignored plea, every second I fought to stay conscious. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would shake our entire family to its core today. In court, as she sat across from me with that same smug expression she always wore, the judge calmly said, "Before we begin, let us watch a family video," and the color drained from her face because she knew exactly which video he meant, the one she prayed would never be seen, the one she thought I was too weak, too confused, too afraid to ever use against her. But this story is not just about survival. It is about the moment a man who had been underestimated, dismissed, and pushed aside decides he will not be silent anymore. Stay with me, because the twists that follow will prove that even the cruelest betrayal can be answered, and that sometimes revenge arrives quietly, like a door opening to the truth that can no longer be hidden. My name is Auguste Vernier. I am 73 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years designing bridges and buildings across Virginia. My wife Helen passed away 2 years ago, leaving me in the house we shared for nearly 5 decades, a house that once felt like a sanctuary but has slowly become something else entirely. The attack came without warning, the way it always does. One moment I was standing at the kitchen counter pouring myself a glass of water before bed. The next, my chest tightened like someone had wrapped iron bands around my ribs and started pulling. I dropped the glass. It shattered against the tile floor, and I barely heard it over the sound of my own desperate wheezing. My inhaler. I needed my inhaler. I had left it on the counter that morning, right next to the coffee maker. My eyes found it immediately small, blue, ordinary, but my legs refused to cooperate. I stumbled forward, knocking against the edge of the counter, my vision already starting to blur at the edges. That's when Sabrina appeared. My daughter-in-law moved quickly across the kitchen, her silk robe flowing behind her like she was gliding rather than walking. For one desperate moment, I felt relief. She would help me. She was family. But instead of handing me the inhaler, she picked it up and held it just beyond my reach, tilting her head like a cat watching a wounded bird. "Breathe, old man," she said, and her voice was soft, almost tender, which made it worse. "Show me how badly you want it." I tried to speak, but could only produce a wet, rattling sound that didn't resemble any word in any language. My hand stretched toward her, trembling, pleading. She took a step back. The kitchen light caught her face, and I saw something there I had never fully allowed myself to see before. Not irritation, not impatience, but genuine pleasure. She was enjoying this. My own daughter-in-law was watching me suffocate, and she was enjoying every second of it. "Mom?" Lucas's voice came from the doorway. My son stood there in his pajamas, hair disheveled from sleep, eyes wide with what should have been concern. I looked at him, my boy, my only child, the baby I had held in my arms 46 years ago and promised to protect forever. "Help me," I wanted to scream. "For God's sake, help your father." But Lucas didn't move. He looked at Sabrina, then at me, then back at Sabrina. And in that terrible moment, I understood something that broke my heart more completely than any physical pain ever could. My son was not afraid for me. He was afraid of her. Sabrina let me struggle for what felt like an eternity. It was probably less than a minute, but when you cannot breathe, every second stretches into its own small lifetime. Finally, almost carelessly, she tossed the inhaler at my feet. I collapsed to my knees, fumbling with the cap, pressing the mechanism to my lips with shaking hands. The medication flooded my lungs like cold water in a desert. I gasped, coughed, gasped again. Tears streamed down my face from the attack or from something deeper. I could not tell. Somewhere behind me, I heard Sabrina's phone buzz. She answered it without hesitation, stepping over my crumpled body like I was nothing more than a piece of furniture she needed to navigate around. "I told you, I'll have the money," she said, her voice tight and strange. "Give me 60 days. I had never heard her speak like that before, desperate, almost frightened. Sabrina was never frightened. Sabrina was the one who frightened others. But whoever was on the other end of that call had power over her. And that knowledge settled into my mind like a puzzle piece I didn't yet know how to place. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I became aware of the kitchen around me in fragments. The broken glass glittering on the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, and in the corner, near the ceiling, a small red light blinking steadily on what I had always assumed was an old smoke detector. Helen had installed it 2 years ago, just before she got sick. I had never thought to question why. The room began to darken at the edges. Whether from exhaustion or shock, I felt myself slipping toward unconsciousness, my cheek pressed against the cold tile floor. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was Sabrina's voice, low and businesslike, speaking to my son as if I were already gone. "We need to talk about guardianship." Tomorrow, I woke in my own bed with no memory of how I got there. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and ordinary, as if the previous night had been nothing more than a fever dream. For a few merciful seconds, I allowed myself to believe it. Then I tried to take a deep breath and felt the rawness in my throat, the ache in my chest, the bruise on my knee where I had fallen against the kitchen tile. It had been real, all of it. The smell of bacon drifted up from downstairs, accompanied by the familiar sounds of breakfast being prepared. I lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what I knew with what I was hearing. Sabrina was cooking. Sabrina, who had held my inhaler just out of reach while I suffocated. Sabrina, who had watched me collapse with something like satisfaction in her eyes. Now she was downstairs making breakfast as if nothing had happened, and I understood with terrible clarity that this was exactly how it would be. There would be no acknowledgement, no apology, no explanation. The silence would erase everything, and I would be expected to go along with it. I dressed slowly, my hands still unsteady, and made my way downstairs. The kitchen had been cleaned. No broken glass, no evidence of my fall, just gleaming countertops and the cheerful sizzle of eggs in a pan. Sabrina turned when she heard me enter, and her smile was so warm, so perfectly calibrated, that for one disorienting moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. "Good morning, Dad," she said brightly. "I made your favorite. Sit down, you need to keep your strength up." Lucas was already at the table, hunched over a cup of coffee. He did not look up when I entered. He did not look up when I sat down across from him. His eyes remained fixed on some invisible point between his hands, and I recognized the posture of a man who had chosen not to see. My son, who had stood in the doorway and done nothing. My son, who was now pretending that nothing had happened at all. Sabrina placed a plate in front of me, eggs, bacon, toast arranged with almost artistic precision. "Eat," she said sweetly. "You had such a restless night. You probably don't even remember half of it." There was a warning buried in those words, a line drawn in the sand. "This is the story. Do not deviate." I ate in silence. The food tasted like ash. The doorbell rang just after 10 o'clock. Sabrina was upstairs by then, and Lucas had retreated to the living room with his laptop, still avoiding my gaze. I answered the door myself and found Marjorie Flint standing on the porch, holding a pot of soup in both hands. Marjorie had lived next door for 3 years, ever since her husband passed away, and she sold their larger home in Richmond. We had exchanged pleasantries over the fence, waved to each other on our respective morning walks, but never more than that. She kept to herself, and I had always respected her privacy. Today, however, she seemed different. There was an intensity in her eyes that I had never noticed before, a sharpness that belied her 72 years. "I made too much soup," she said, extending the pot toward me. "Thought you might like some." I thanked her and took it, expecting her to leave. She didn't. Instead, she glanced past me into the house, then lowered her voice. "I heard something last night," she said carefully. "Through my bedroom window. It sounded like someone was having trouble breathing, gasping, coughing, that kind of thing." She paused, her eyes searching my face. "And then I heard someone laughing. A woman's laugh. While the gasping was still going on, my throat tightened. I said nothing." Marjorie nodded slowly, as if my silence had confirmed something she already suspected. "I'm not trying to pry," she continued. "I just wanted you to know that I heard, and I'm paying attention." She started to turn away, then stopped. "Your daughter-in-law, what was her maiden name? Coletti, wasn't it?" The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said. Sabrina Coletti. Why do you ask? Something flickered across Marjorie's face recognition. Then something darker, something that looked almost like old pain resurfacing after years of burial. She forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. No reason, she said. Just curious. You take care of yourself, Mr. Vernier. I watched her walk down the driveway toward her car, the pot of soup growing cold in my hands. Just before she opened her car door, I saw her lips move. She was speaking to herself, too quietly for me to hear from this distance. But I could have sworn, though perhaps it was only my imagination, that she said something about mothers and daughters. That night, I could not sleep. I wandered the house like a ghost, touching Helen's things, trying to feel her presence in the objects she had left behind. That is how I found Sabrina in the bedroom that had once belonged to my wife and me, the room I had not been able to enter since Helen's death. She was sitting at Helen's vanity, going through the jewelry box that contained 50 years of memories, anniversary gifts, birthday presents, the pearl earrings Helen wore on our wedding day. What are you doing? My voice came out hoarse, strange. Sabrina looked up without a trace of guilt. These are just sitting here collecting dust, she said, holding up a ruby bracelet I had given Helen for our 30th anniversary. Someone should get use out of them. It's not like she needs them anymore. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tear the bracelet from her hands and throw her out of my house, but I did neither. I stood in the doorway, silent, watching her sort through my wife's treasures like a vulture picking through carrion, and something inside me, something that had been soft and forgiving for 73 years, began to harden into stone. The announcement came 3 days later, delivered with the same cheerful efficiency Sabrina brought to everything. We were sitting at the dinner table, Lucas, Sabrina, their daughter Amelia, and me, when she set down her fork and smiled that practiced smile I had come to dread. Dad, we've been talking, she said, gesturing vaguely toward Lucas, who kept his eyes fixed on his plate. And we think it would be safer for you to move to the basement. Those stairs to your bedroom are just too dangerous at your age. What happened the other night, the fall, the confusion, we can't risk that happening again. I opened my mouth to protest, to point out that I had not fallen on the stairs, that my so-called confusion had been an asthma attack she herself had prolonged, but the words died before they reached my lips. What was the point? The narrative had already been written. I was old, fragile, declining. Any objection I raised would only confirm the story they were constructing. I think that's a good idea, Lucas said quietly, still not meeting my eyes. For your safety, Dad. The betrayal of it stole my breath more completely than any asthma attack. My own son, agreeing to banish me to the basement of the house I had built with my own hands, the house where I had raised him, where his mother had died. I looked at him, really looked, searching for some trace of the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man who had wept at his mother's funeral. But Lucas had disappeared behind a mask of careful neutrality, and I understood that Sabrina had been shaping him for years, hollowing him out piece by piece until nothing remained but obedience. When I climbed the stairs to my bedroom to begin packing, I found my belongings already boxed. They had done it while I was eating breakfast that morning, moving through my private space, handling my possessions, deciding what I would and would not be allowed to keep. The efficiency of it chilled me. This had not been a spontaneous decision. This had been planned. Amelia appeared in the doorway as I stood staring at the boxes. She was 16 years old, sharp and watchful in ways that reminded me painfully of Helen. Without a word, she picked up one of the smaller boxes and started down the stairs. I followed with another, and we worked in silence for several trips before she finally spoke. "Grandpa," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure we were alone. "Something's wrong. Mom's been acting strange for months, worse than usual." She set down the box she was carrying and looked at me with eyes too old for her age. "I heard her on the phone with Grandma Gloria last week. Grandma was crying, begging. She kept saying please over and over, and Mom just kept telling her to be quiet, that she'd handle it." Amelia's voice dropped even lower. "What do you think she meant? Handle what?" Before I could answer, we heard footsteps above us. Amelia grabbed her box and hurried down the remaining stairs, leaving me alone with questions I could not answer, and a growing sense that whatever was happening in this house extended far beyond my own mistreatment. The basement had been converted into a guest suite years ago, back when Helen and I imagined ourselves hosting grandchildren for summer visits. There was a small bedroom, a bathroom, a sitting area with a television. Comfortable enough, but as I arranged my few remaining possessions in this underground space, I could not shake the feeling of being buried alive. Late that afternoon, I went upstairs for a glass of water and heard Sabrina's voice coming from the garage. The door was slightly ajar, and something in her tone made me stop. Gone was the smooth confidence, the controlled sweetness. This was a woman on the edge. I said, "I'll get the money," she hissed into her phone. 60 days, that's what we agreed. Don't you dare threaten me. A pause. I know what happens if I don't pay. You don't have to remind me. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm liquidating some assets right now. Jewelry, antiques, whatever I can move fast. You'll have it. Just give me the time. I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. Through the crack in the door, I could see her pacing beside Lucas's car, her free hand clutching something that glinted in the dim light. Helen's ruby bracelet, the one I had seen her examining just days ago. She was photographing it, her fingers flying across her phone screen between sentences. 200,000, she said, her voice cracking. I know what I owe. Just give me 60 days. $200,000. The number hung in the air like a verdict. Whatever trouble Sabrina had gotten herself into, it was not small. And suddenly, her interest in guardianship, in controlling my finances, in moving me to the basement where I could be more easily managed, all of it snapped into focus with terrible clarity. I was not just an inconvenience to her. I was an asset to be liquidated. That night, alone in my basement room, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and held a framed photograph of Helen. It was my favorite picture of her, taken on our 40th anniversary, her silver hair catching the sunlight as she laughed at something I had said. I traced the outline of her face with my finger. What did you know that I didn't? I whispered to her image. What did you see that I refused to see? The photograph offered no answers. Helen smiled, her eternal smile, frozen in a moment before any of this had begun, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message, sent at 7 minutes past midnight, from Amelia. Grandpa, I found something on Dad's laptop. You need to see this. Don't tell anyone. I waited until the house fell silent before climbing the basement stairs. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a gunshot in the darkness, but I could not wait until morning. Amelia's message had carried an urgency that matched the growing dread in my chest, and I knew that whatever she had found would change everything. She was waiting for me in the upstairs hallway. Her face pale in the blue glow of the laptop she clutched against her chest. Without a word, she led me to the small study at the end of the hall, the room Helen had used for correspondence, now abandoned and dusty, the last place anyone would think to look for us. Amelia closed the door with exaggerated care and set the laptop on Helen's old desk. I wasn't snooping, she whispered, her fingers trembling as she opened the screen. Dad left his email open, and I saw Mom's name in the subject line. I thought maybe it was something about Grandma Gloria, something that would explain why she was crying. She turned the laptop toward me. It's worse than that, Grandpa. It's so much worse. The email chain stretched back several weeks. A correspondence between Sabrina and an attorney I had never heard of. The subject line read, Emergency Guardianship Petition Vernier, August. My own name reduced to a legal matter, a problem to be solved. I leaned closer, my reading glasses fogging with the heat of my breath, and began to scroll. The language was clinical, devastating. Sabrina had described me as increasingly confused and disoriented, prone to episodes of memory loss and irrational behavior. She claimed I had become a danger to myself and others, citing the night of my asthma attack as evidence of my declining mental state. He fell in the kitchen and could not remember how to use his own medication, she had written. My husband and I found him on the floor, incoherent and aggressive when we tried to help. Every word was a lie, carefully constructed to paint a picture of a feeble old man who could no longer be trusted with his own affairs. But the worst discovery came in an attachment, a preliminary guardianship petition already filled out and awaiting submission. At the bottom, above the line marked family member signature, was Lucas's name. I recognized my son's handwriting immediately, the distinctive way he crossed his T's, the slight backward slant he had never been able to correct. Except something was wrong. The signature was too perfect, too practiced, lacking the small inconsistencies that mark genuine handwriting. I had watched Lucas sign hundreds of documents over the years: birthday cards, school forms, legal papers for Helen's estate. This was not his signature. This was a forgery, and not a particularly good one. She signed it herself, Amelia said quietly, reading my expression. I've seen her practice Dad's signature before. She thinks no one notices, but I notice everything. I closed the laptop slowly, my mind racing. Sabrina was not merely hoping to control me. She was building a legal case to strip away my autonomy entirely, to seize control of my finances, my property, my very existence. And she was doing it with forged documents and fabricated evidence, confident that no one would believe the confused ramblings of an old man over the concerned testimony of his devoted daughter-in-law. I needed proof. I needed something more than suspicion. And for reasons I could not explain, my eyes drifted to Helen's old desk, the antique roll-top she had inherited from her grandmother, the only piece of furniture in this room that still carried her scent, her presence. Helen had always been the organized one. Files and folders, labeled and dated, everything in its proper place. But as I ran my hands along the familiar wood, searching for I knew not what, my fingers found something unexpected. A seam in the back panel, too straight to be natural. I pressed, and a small compartment clicked open, revealing a space I had never known existed. Inside were 2 envelopes, both addressed in Helen's elegant handwriting. The first said, "Open immediately if you feel unsafe." The second, "Only open when you stand before a judge." My hands shook as I tore open the first envelope. The letter inside was dated 18 months ago, 6 months before Helen died, written in her familiar script, now made ghostly by the knowledge that she had composed these words while cancer slowly claimed her body. "My darling August," it began. "If you're reading this, I was right about her. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed that what I saw was paranoia, the fear of a dying woman desperate to protect the man she loves. But if this letter is in your hands, then my fears were justified, and you are no longer safe in your own home." I read on, my vision blurring with tears I did not bother to wipe away. Helen explained that she had installed cameras in the common areas of the house, the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, hidden inside ordinary objects. Smoke detectors, clock radios, picture frames. She had done it secretly, telling no one, because she needed evidence of things she had only glimpsed in fragments. Sabrina's cruelty when she thought no one was watching, the way she spoke to me when Helen was too sick to leave her bed, the conversations she had on the phone, always just out of earshot, always stopping the moment someone entered the room. "The password is our wedding anniversary," Helen wrote. "Don't be surprised by what you see. I tried to stop her before I left this world. I tried to warn Lucas, but he couldn't hear me. He loves her too much to see her clearly. So I did what I could. I left you armor, my love. I left you proof." I pressed the letter to my chest, overwhelmed by a grief so sharp it felt like dying. Helen had known. Even as she lay dying, she had seen the danger gathering around me and had done everything in her power to prepare. She had loved me enough to plan for a future she would never see, to protect me from beyond the grave. The second envelope sat unopened in my lap, its instruction clear: "Only open when you stand before a judge." I wanted desperately to tear it open, to know everything Helen had prepared, but she had been specific, and I had trusted her judgment for 50 years. I would not stop now. I read the final line of her letter once more, committing it to memory like a prayer. "The woman you call daughter-in-law showed me her true face. I made sure she would never forget mine." I waited until the house was empty the next afternoon. Lucas had gone to work, Sabrina to what she claimed was a hair appointment, and Amelia to school. The moment I heard Sabrina's car pull out of the driveway, I began my search. Helen's letter had mentioned cameras hidden in ordinary objects, smoke detectors, clock radios, picture frames. I started in the kitchen, where the nightmare had begun, and found it almost immediately. The smoke detector in the corner, the one with the small red light I had noticed the night of my attack, was not a smoke detector at all. I climbed onto a chair, my old knees protesting, and carefully removed it from the ceiling. The device was heavier than it should have been, and when I turned it over, I found a small memory card slot and a USB port concealed beneath a sliding panel. It took me an hour to locate the central hub, a small black box hidden behind a false panel in the hall closet, connected to cameras throughout the house. Helen had chosen her hiding spots well. Anyone searching casually would never have found it. But I was not searching casually. I was searching like a man whose life depended on it, because perhaps it did. I connected the hub to my old laptop and entered the password Helen had provided, 06141974, our wedding anniversary. The day I had promised to love and protect her for the rest of my life. The day she had apparently begun protecting me. The files were organized by date and location, hundreds of hours of footage spanning nearly 2 years. I scrolled to the most recent kitchen recordings first, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. And there it was, the night of my asthma attack, captured in high definition from an angle I had never seen. Watching it was like witnessing my own death from outside my body. I saw myself collapse against the counter, saw the glass shatter on the floor. I saw Sabrina enter the frame with that gliding walk, saw her pick up my inhaler and hold it just beyond my reach. But what the video revealed, what I had not been able to see while fighting for breath, was her face, the smile, the genuine, unmistakable pleasure she took in my suffering. She had watched me struggle for exactly 47 seconds. I counted them. 47 seconds of deliberate cruelty before she threw the inhaler at my feet like scraps to a dog, and behind her, frozen in the doorway, Lucas watched it all and did nothing. The second video I found was older, dated 3 weeks before my attack. Sabrina, alone in my study, going through the filing cabinet where I kept my financial documents. She had a notebook beside her, copying down numbers, taking photographs of bank statements with her phone. As she worked, she spoke to herself in a low, satisfied voice. Once I'm guardian, I control everything. The house, the accounts, his pension. She paused to photograph another document. He won't need it where he's going. Where he's going. The words echoed in my mind long after the video ended. She had been planning this for weeks, perhaps months. The asthma attack, the basement, the guardianship petition, all of it was part of a larger design, a systematic dismantling of my life. A third file caught my attention, separated from the others in a folder Helen had labeled important. The file name was different from the rest, not a date and location, but a phrase, when she showed her face MP4. I clicked on it, and a password prompt appeared. I tried our anniversary again. Invalid. I tried Helen's birthday, my birthday, our children's birthdays. Invalid. 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 Whatever Helen had hidden in this file, she had protected it with a key I did not yet possess. I returned to the main folder, scrolling through older recordings, searching for anything that might reveal the password. That is when I found a video that stopped my heart. It was not from our house. The background showed a different kitchen, one I did not recognize, with yellow curtains and a ceramic rooster on the counter. But I recognized the voice immediately. Sabrina, speaking on speakerphone while someone on the other end wept. "Please, Sabrina," the voice sobbed. It was an older woman, her words thick with tears and desperation. "Please give me my medication. I'll do whatever you want. I'll sign anything. Just please, please give me my pills." Sabrina's response was cold, almost bored. "Then stop calling. Stop asking questions, and stop talking to anyone about our family business. When you learn to behave, you'll get your medication." The voice on the phone dissolved into broken sobs. "Please, I'm your mother. Please." I stared at the screen long after the recording ended, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. Gloria, Sabrina's own mother, begging for medication the same way I had begged for my inhaler. The same cruelty, the same calculated withholding, the same pleasure in another person's suffering. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was not Sabrina's first victim. She had done this before. She had perfected this technique on her own mother, learned exactly how to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining deniability. I was simply the next target in a pattern that stretched back years. I could not fight this battle alone. The evidence I had gathered was damning, but evidence without expertise is just information, and information in the wrong hands could be turned against me. I needed someone who understood the law, who could navigate the system Sabrina was trying to weaponize. I needed an attorney. A former colleague from my engineering days had mentioned a name once, years ago, during a conversation about a mutual friend whose children were trying to have him declared incompetent. Julian North. he had said. Specializes in elder law. Fights like hell for his clients. I had filed the name away, never imagining I would need it. Now, I retrieved it like a lifeline. Julian North's office was in a modest brick building downtown, the kind of place that spoke of competence rather than flash. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 58 or 60, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a handshake that conveyed both strength and patience. I had called ahead and explained only the basics: family conflict, concerns about guardianship, evidence I needed evaluated. But when I handed him the USB drive containing Helen's camera footage, I saw something shift in his expression. He had heard stories like mine before, perhaps too many times. We sat in silence while he watched the videos. The inhaler incident, Sabrina rifling through my financial documents, Gloria's desperate phone call. When he finally looked up, his face was grave. "Mr. Vernier," he said slowly, "this isn't just cruelty. This is systematic elder abuse. The pattern is textbook isolation, financial exploitation, medical neglect used as control. And if she did this to her own mother, there may be records, official complaints, even if they never went anywhere." He turned to his computer and began typing, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Gloria Coletti," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Let's see what we can find." What he found made my blood run cold. 10 years ago, Gloria had filed an elder abuse complaint against her own daughter. The details were sparse in the public record, but the basics were clear. Allegations of financial exploitation, medication withholding, emotional abuse. The complaint had been filed with Adult Protective Services in Gloria's home county, investigated for 3 weeks, and then abruptly withdrawn. She was pressured, Julian explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this pattern too many times. Victims often are. The abuser threatens them, manipulates them, convinces them that dropping the complaint is the only way to keep the peace. Sometimes other family members get involved, telling the victim they're overreacting, destroying family harmony over nothing. He leaned back in his chair. "But here's the important thing, Mr. Vernier. The file still exists. Withdrawn complaints don't disappear. They become dormant, and dormant files can be woken up." That evening, back in my basement room, I found myself unable to sleep. I picked up my phone and began scrolling aimlessly, a habit I had developed since Helen's death, a way to fill the empty hours. That is when I saw it, an online marketplace listing, posted just hours ago. The photograph showed Helen's antique engagement ring, the one her grandmother had passed down, the one she had worn for 50 years, the one I had slipped onto her finger on a June afternoon in 1974. The ring I had specifically asked to be buried with her, only to be told by Sabrina that it was too valuable to waste. The description read, "Estate sale, beautiful antique diamond ring. Excellent condition. Need quick sale. Serious inquiries only. Need quick sale." The desperation was no longer hidden. Sabrina was liquidating everything she could get her hands on, racing against some deadline I still did not fully understand. $200,000 in 60 days. The number from her phone call echoed in my mind. Whatever trouble she had gotten herself into, it was closing in fast. I forwarded the listing to Julian the next morning. His response came within the hour. "Come to my office. We need to talk about strategy." When I arrived, Julian was standing at his window, staring out at the street below. He did not turn around immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, careful, measured, as if he were weighing each word before releasing it. "Mr. Vernier, we need to move carefully," he said. "You have evidence, but evidence can be contested. She'll claim the videos are edited, that you're confused, that this is all a misunderstanding by a grieving old man who never accepted his daughter-in-law." He turned to face me. "More importantly, if she's in financial trouble, real trouble, the kind that involves people who don't resolve disputes through lawyers, then she's desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, but they're also dangerous. We cannot afford to underestimate her." I nodded, though my hands had begun to tremble again. "What do we do?" Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down across from me, his expression shifting to something almost gentle. "Mr. Vernier, I think I know someone who might help us. Someone who knows exactly what Sabrina is capable of, because she lived through it herself." Julian's words stayed with me as I drove home. turning over possibilities in my mind. Someone who knew what Sabrina was capable of. Someone who had lived through it. He had not given me a name, only a promise to make contact, to see if this person would be willing to help. In the meantime, I had work of my own to do. Marjorie answered her door on the second knock, still in her gardening clothes, soil on her knees, and a trowel in her hand. She looked unsurprised to see me, as if she had been waiting for this visit ever since she delivered that pot of soup and asked about Sabrina's maiden name. "I need your help," I said without preamble. "I need someone to testify about what you heard the night I had my asthma attack. The laughing, the sounds of me struggling while someone watched." Marjorie studied me for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. Then she stepped aside and gestured me into her living room. "I've been waiting for you to ask," she said quietly. "I'll testify. I'll tell them exactly what I heard that night, every detail, under oath if necessary." Relief flooded through me, but it was tempered by the strange intensity in her eyes. I pulled out my phone and showed her a photograph of Sabrina, one Amelia had sent me from a family gathering last year. "This is her," I said, "my daughter-in-law." The woman, I believe, was laughing while I couldn't breathe. Marjorie took the phone from my hand and stared at the image. She stared for far too long, not the casual glance of someone confirming a face, but the fixed gaze of someone confronting a ghost. Her jaw tightened. Her knuckles went white around the phone's edge. "She looks just like her mother," she whispered finally. "The same eyes, the same smile. God help me, the same smile." "You knew her mother?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Diane Coletti?" But Marjorie had already turned away, setting the phone on the coffee table as if it burned her fingers. "I'll testify about what I heard," she repeated, her voice now flat, controlled. "That's all I can promise for now. Some stories take time to tell, Mr. Vernier. When I'm ready, you'll hear mine." I did not press her. I had learned enough about secrets in recent weeks to know that they revealed themselves on their own schedule, not anyone else's. That evening, Amelia came to my basement room with her laptop clutched against her chest, the same way she had carried it the night she showed me the guardianship emails. But this time, her expression was different, not frightened, but resolute. She sat beside me on the narrow bed and opened a folder containing audio files, each one labeled with a date and brief description. "I've been recording Mom for 6 months," she said quietly. "Ever since I heard Grandma Gloria crying on the phone, begging her to give back her pills. I didn't understand what I was hearing at first. I thought maybe Grandma was confused, or sick, or just old. But then I started paying attention, really paying attention. There were 12 files in total, 12 recordings documenting Sabrina's manipulation, her threats, her financial scheming. In one, she coached Lucas on what to say if anyone asked about my declining mental state. In another, she discussed selling the house with a real estate agent, speaking as if she already owned it. In a third, she screamed at Gloria over the phone, calling her worthless and pathetic and threatening to make sure she died alone. "Amelia," I breathed, overwhelmed by the scope of what my granddaughter had accomplished. "Why didn't you tell someone? Why didn't you tell your father?" She looked at me with eyes that had grown old too fast. "Because I wasn't sure whose side he was on." The confrontation came later that night. I heard raised voices from upstairs, Lucas and Amelia, arguing in the hallway outside her bedroom. I crept up the basement stairs and listened from the shadows. "Why won't you talk to your mother anymore?" Lucas demanded. "She's been nothing but good to you, and you treat her like a stranger, like an enemy." Amelia's response was cold, steady, utterly without fear. "Because I know what she is. The question is, Dad, do you?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ticking of the hallway clock. Then Lucas turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I retreated to my basement room, but sleep would not come. Near midnight, I climbed the stairs again for a glass of water and found Lucas sitting alone in the dark living room, illuminated only by the glow of his phone. He was staring at the screen with an expression I had never seen on his face, something caught between anguish and determination. The moment he sensed my presence, he shoved the phone into his pocket, his movements quick and guilty. "Dad," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't hear you come up." "Couldn't sleep," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You either, it seems." He nodded but said nothing more. I continued to the kitchen, filled my glass, and returned the way I had come. But as I descended the basement stairs, I heard Lucas's voice behind me, barely a whisper, not meant for anyone's ears. I should have done this years ago. The invitation came 2 days later, delivered with Sabrina's most gracious smile. A family dinner, she announced, to clear the air and reconnect as a family. She spoke as if the past weeks had been nothing more than a misunderstanding, a temporary rough patch that could be smoothed over with good food and pleasant conversation. I recognized the performance for what it was, but I agreed without hesitation. Julian had prepared me for this moment. The recording device was small enough to fit in my shirt pocket, disguised as an ordinary pen. Julian had shown me how to activate it with a simple click, how the sensitive microphone would capture every word within a 15-foot radius. Let her talk, he had advised. The more comfortable she feels, the more she'll reveal. People like Sabrina can't resist explaining how clever they are. The dining room table was set with Helen's good china plates I had not seen since her funeral reception, now arranged with cruel irony for this charade of family unity. Candles flickered in silver holders, wine gleamed in crystal glasses. Sabrina had outdone herself, creating a stage set designed to project warmth and normalcy. I took my seat and clicked the pen in my pocket. "It's so good to have everyone together," Sabrina began, her voice dripping with sweetness as she served the roast she had prepared. "We've all been under so much stress lately. I think we just need to remember that we're family, and family takes care of each other." She kept up the performance through the first course and into the second, asking about my health with apparent concern, reminiscing about happy memories that somehow all featured her in a flattering light. Lucas sat rigid in his chair, eating mechanically, avoiding everyone's eyes. Amelia pushed food around her plate in silence, her jaw tight with suppressed anger. The documents appeared between the main course and dessert. Sabrina produced them from a folder beside her chair, sliding them across the table toward me with the casual confidence of someone presenting a minor formality. "I had our attorney draw these up," she said smoothly. "Just a simple power of attorney, so Lucas and I can help manage your affairs. You know, handle the bills, deal with the bank. Make sure everything runs smoothly. It would take such a burden off your shoulders." I looked at the papers without touching them. The language was dense, legal, designed to obscure its true purpose. But I had seen enough documents in my engineering career to recognize a trap when one was laid before me. "No," I said simply. "I won't sign these." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Sabrina's smile remained fixed, but something behind her eyes shifted, hardened. "Dad," she said, the sweetness in her voice now carrying an edge, "we're only trying to help. You've been confused lately, forgetful. The incident in the kitchen, the fall." "There was no fall," I interrupted. "There was an asthma attack that you prolonged by withholding my medication. I remember every second of it." The mask slipped. I watched it happen in real time, the pleasant expression crumbling, replaced by something cold and contemptuous. The transformation was so complete, it was almost fascinating, like watching a snake shed its skin. "You stubborn, useless old man," she hissed. "You're living on borrowed time in a house you can barely maintain, hoarding assets you'll never spend. Your pension, your savings, the equity in this property, do you have any idea how much that adds up to? And you think you can manage all that?" She laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You can barely manage the stairs. That's why we moved you to the basement, remember? Because you're too feeble to climb to your own bedroom. That's enough." Amelia's voice cut through the room like a blade. She had risen from her chair, her face pale but determined. "Don't talk to my grandfather like that. He's done nothing but love this family. And you're nothing but a parasite." What happened next occurred so fast I almost didn't register it. Sabrina's hand flew across the table and connected with Amelia's cheek, the sound of the slap echoing off the dining room walls. Amelia stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face, shock and pain flooding her eyes. The room froze. For one terrible moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Lucas rose from his chair, and I felt a surge of desperate hope. Surely he would defend his daughter, would finally stand against the woman who had controlled him for so long. Instead, he grabbed Amelia by the arm and struck her across the face with his open palm. "Show some respect," he screamed, his voice cracking with something that sounded almost like hysteria. "She's your mother. You don't speak to your mother that way." Amelia crumpled against the wall, both hands pressed to her face, silent tears streaming through her fingers. She did not make a sound, not a cry, not a whimper, and somehow that silence was more devastating than any scream could have been. I stood slowly. My legs felt weak, my heart felt shattered, but my voice was steady when I spoke. Lucas. I waited until my son turned to face me, until I could see the mixture of fear and defiance in his eyes. From this moment forward, you are no longer my son. Get out of my house. Both of you. Now. Sabrina began to protest, her voice rising in indignation, but I did not hear the words. I was watching Lucas, watching the way his face crumpled and then hardened, watching him help his wife gather her things with the mechanical movements of a man whose soul had left his body. They moved toward the door, Sabrina still talking, still spinning some narrative I no longer had the capacity to absorb. At the threshold, Lucas paused. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and I saw him slip something inside, something small and rectangular, catching the light for just an instant. A USB drive. He glanced back at me over his shoulder, and in his eyes I saw something I could not interpret. Guilt, perhaps. Shame, or something else, entirely, something that looked almost like a message I was not yet meant to understand. Then the door closed behind them, and I was alone with my granddaughter and the wreckage of everything I had believed about my family. We left that night. I could not stay another hour in a house that had become a crime scene, surrounded by memories now poisoned by betrayal. I packed what little I needed into a single suitcase: clothes, medication, Helen's letters, and climbed the stairs to tell Amelia we were leaving. I found her already packed, sitting on the edge of her bed with a duffel bag at her feet, her face still bearing the red marks of her parents' hands. She looked up when I appeared in her doorway, and before I could speak, she answered the question I had not yet asked. "I'm coming with you," she said. "I don't care where we're going. I'm not staying here." There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. At 16 years old, my granddaughter had weighed her options and chosen her path with more clarity than most adults ever achieve. I wanted to tell her she should stay, that involving herself in this battle would only bring her pain. But I knew she was already involved. She had been gathering evidence for months, watching her mother with the clear eyes of someone who refused to look away from the truth. She had earned the right to stand beside me. Julian arranged everything. Within hours, he had secured us a room at a modest motel outside of town and begun the paperwork for a temporary protective arrangement. Virginia law, he explained, allowed a minor of Amelia's age to request a change of guardianship under certain circumstances, particularly when there was documented evidence of an unsafe home environment. The recordings Amelia had collected, combined with the footage from Helen's cameras, painted a picture no judge could ignore. By midnight, I had become my granddaughter's emergency guardian, a legal shield against any attempt by Sabrina to drag her back. The next morning, I drove to a medical complex in downtown Richmond to confront the accusation I knew Sabrina would make. If she intended to claim I was mentally unfit, I would prove otherwise before she had the chance. The psychologist Julian recommended Dr. Patricia Webb, a specialist in geriatric cognitive assessment, welcomed me with professional warmth and explained that the evaluation would take approximately 90 minutes. The tests were thorough: memory recall, pattern recognition, mathematical reasoning, verbal fluency, emotional regulation. I drew clocks, repeated number sequences, identified logical inconsistencies in hypothetical scenarios. At one point, Dr. Webb presented me with a complex engineering problem, a structural load calculation that would have challenged some of my former colleagues, and watched as I solved it in under 4 minutes. When the final test concluded, she removed her glasses and smiled. "Mr. Vernier," she said, "you are sharper than most people half your age. Whatever anyone might claim about your mental state, this evaluation will stand as definitive proof that you are fully competent to manage your own affairs." She signed the report with a flourish. I almost wish more of my patients scored this well. I left her office with documentation that would destroy Sabrina's guardianship petition before it ever reached a courtroom. But I had underestimated the speed of her desperation. The call from Julian came that afternoon, his voice tight with controlled anger. Sabrina had filed an emergency petition with the court, claiming that I had kidnapped Amelia. The language was inflammatory. Elderly family member, experiencing cognitive decline, had removed a minor child from her lawful parents' custody using manipulation and coercion. She demanded an immediate court date and Amelia's return to her care. "It's absurd," Julian said. Amelia is 16. Virginia law recognizes her right to make this choice, especially with the documentation we have. But Sabrina knows that. She's not trying to win, she's trying to buy time. Every day she delays is another day to cover her tracks, destroy evidence, construct her defense. We would not give her that time. Julian filed our countersuit the same day, a comprehensive complaint alleging elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud. The video footage, the audio recordings, the forged signature on the guardianship petition, the evidence of Sabrina's desperate financial situation, all of it was compiled, documented, and submitted to the court. Julian included a request for expedited proceedings, citing the ongoing threat to both myself and Amelia. The battle lines were drawn. What had begun as a quiet campaign of cruelty in the shadows would now be fought in the light of a courtroom, with everything at stake. That evening, my phone rang. I did not recognize the number, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was familiar, cold, controlled, and seething with barely contained rage. "You think you've won something?" Sabrina said. There was no pretense of sweetness now, no mask of the devoted daughter-in-law. This was the real woman, stripped bare. "You think filing a few papers makes you safe? I will destroy every piece of evidence you have, every single one, and when I'm done, no one will believe a word you say." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood in the motel room, phone still pressed to my ear, and felt something I had not expected. Not fear, anticipation. Sabrina made good on her threat within 48 hours. The security alert came to my phone at 2:17 inches, the morning motion detected at the primary residence. I sat up in the motel bed, my heart pounding, and opened the app that Helen had linked to the camera system months before her death. What I saw confirmed every fear and, paradoxically, every hope. Sabrina moved through my darkened house like a woman possessed. She had entered through the back door. I watched her pick the lock with practiced efficiency, a skill that raised disturbing questions about her past, and gone straight for the hall closet where the central hub was hidden. She knew exactly where to look, which meant she had been searching for days, perhaps weeks, piecing together the location from small clues I had not been careful enough to hide. The destruction was methodical. She pulled the hub from its concealment and smashed it against the floor, stomping on the pieces until nothing remained but plastic shards and twisted wire. Then she moved through the house, locating each camera with unnerving precision, the kitchen smoke detector, the living room picture frame, the hallway clock. One by one, she tore them from their mountings and destroyed them. When she finished, she stood in the wreckage, breathing hard, a smile of triumph spreading across her face. She thought she had won. She thought the evidence was gone. What Sabrina did not know, what she could not have known, was that Helen had been more thorough than either of us. The camera system was not self-contained. Every recording, from the moment Helen activated the system, had been automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server. The hard drives Sabrina destroyed were merely local backups. The real archive existed in a data center 300 miles away, untouchable, complete. But that was not the only mistake Sabrina made that night. Marjorie called me at 7 the next morning, her voice carrying a strange mixture of satisfaction and old grief. "I saw her," she said without preamble. "I've been watching your house since you left, Mr. Vernier. I knew she would try something. Last night I saw her car pull up, saw her break in, and I recorded everything." She paused. 20 minutes of video on my phone, clear as day, her face, her actions, everything. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by a gratitude I could not adequately express. "Marjorie," I said, "why? Why have you been watching? Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed older somehow, weighted with decades of suppressed pain. "Come to my house," she said. "It's time you knew the truth." I found her waiting on her porch, 2 cups of coffee already poured, her face set in the expression of someone about to reopen an old wound. I sat beside her, and she began to speak. 20 years ago, I was a different woman, comfortable, happy. My husband Frank and I had worked our whole lives, saved everything we could, planned for a retirement full of travel and grandchildren and peace. She took a long, shaky breath. "Then I met Diane Coletti." The name hit me like a physical blow. Sabrina's mother. The woman whose tears I had heard on Helen's recordings, begging for medication, calling her own daughter a monster. Diane was charming, Marjorie continued. Sophisticated. She talked about investment opportunities, real estate deals that couldn't fail. She showed us documents, projections, testimonials from other investors. Everything looked legitimate. Frank was cautious, but I convinced him. I trusted her. Her voice cracked. We invested everything. Our savings. Our home equity. $300,000, Mr. Vernier. Every penny we had. I did not need to ask what happened next. The story wrote itself in the lines of Marjorie's face. It was a fraud. All of it. Diane disappeared with our money and a dozen other victims' money. By the time we realized what had happened, she was gone, relocated, remarried, untraceable. We lost our home. Frank's health collapsed under the stress. He died 6 months later. She looked at me with eyes that had long ago exhausted their tears. The doctors called it a heart attack. I called it murder by another name. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The video of Sabrina's break-in still cued on the screen. 3 years ago, I learned that Diane's daughter had married someone in this neighborhood, a man named Lucas Vernier. I sold what little I had rebuilt and bought the house next to yours. Not for revenge. Not exactly. I wanted to watch, to wait, to make sure that what happened to me didn't happen to someone else. She met my eyes. I'm sorry I didn't act sooner, but I needed to be sure. Now I am. Julian arrived at the motel that afternoon, his expression caught between professional caution and genuine amazement. He had spent the morning on the phone with Gloria Coletti, Sabrina's mother, the woman whose cries I had heard on the recordings. He had expected hostility, denial, a hung-up call. Instead, he had found something none of us anticipated. She listened, Julian said, setting down his briefcase. She asked questions. She cried. He paused, seeming to gather himself. And then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "It's time I stopped being afraid of my own daughter." I felt the ground shift beneath me. Gloria, the woman Sabrina had tormented, whose medication she had withheld, whose spirit she had crushed, was willing to stand against her. She agreed to testify, Julian continued, his voice taking on a note of something like awe. But she has one condition. She wants to do it in person, face to face with Sabrina, in open court. She says Sabrina has spent 20 years making her feel invisible. She wants her daughter to look her in the eye while she tells the truth. The week before trial moved with the strange duality of time under pressure, each hour dragging like a year, yet the days vanishing before I could catch my breath. Julian worked around the clock, organizing evidence, preparing witnesses, anticipating every possible angle of attack. But we were not the only ones preparing. Sabrina had hired Victor Ashworth, a defense attorney whose reputation preceded him like a storm warning. I had heard the name before, a man known for aggressive tactics, theatrical courtroom performances, and a particular talent for discrediting witnesses. He had built his career on reasonable doubt, on muddying clear waters until juries could no longer tell truth from fabrication. Julian showed me an interview Ashworth had given to a legal publication years ago, in which he had boasted that evidence is just a story told by one side. My job is to tell a better one. His strategy became clear through pre-trial motions. Every piece of evidence we had gathered was challenged as potentially fabricated. The camera footage, Ashworth argued, could have been edited or staged. Amelia's recordings were the work of a troubled teenager manipulated by her grandfather into betraying her own mother. Even Dr. Webb's competency evaluation was questioned. Perhaps I had simply been having a good day, or perhaps the tests themselves were inadequate to capture my true decline. The arguments were absurd, but they were delivered with such confidence that I understood how Sabrina had evaded consequences her entire life. She had always found someone willing to tell her story better than the truth could tell itself. Julian remained calm in the face of these attacks, but I could see the extra hours wearing on him. Late one evening, he called me with a strange note in his voice, something between amusement and cautious hope. "I received an interesting phone call today," he said. Anonymous, male voice. He asked a hypothetical question. If someone had additional evidence that hadn't been submitted yet, would it be too late to come forward? My heart stuttered. Lucas. I recognized his voice immediately, Julian confirmed. But I played along. I told him the truth. The truth is never too late, but courage sometimes is. He paused. He didn't say anything else, just hung up. But the fact that he called at all tells me something is happening inside him. Whether it's enough to make a difference, I don't know. I thought of the USB drive I had seen Lucas slip into his pocket the night of the dinner, the way he had glanced back at me with that unreadable expression. What had he been collecting? How long had he been keeping secrets of his own? And most importantly, when the moment came, would he choose truth over survival? Julian's preparation was meticulous. He walked me through the case he had built, the camera footage showing Sabrina's cruelty in undeniable detail, Amelia's 12 audio recordings documenting months of manipulation and threats, Marjorie's phone video of the break-in, proving Sabrina's consciousness of guilt, Dr. Webb's evaluation and written testimony establishing my complete mental competency, and finally, the decade-old abuse complaint filed by Gloria Coletti evidenced that Sabrina's pattern of predation stretched back far longer than anyone had known. "But I'm holding something back," Julian admitted. "Gloria herself. The prosecution wants to call her early, establish the pattern, but I want to wait. I want Sabrina to feel confident, to think she's winning before her own mother walks through those doors." He looked at me with the steady gaze of a man who had learned to play the long game. "Surprise is a weapon, Mr. Verny, and Gloria's testimony will be our nuclear option." 2 days before trial, Amelia's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it in silence, her face going pale, then handed me the phone without a word. The message had come from Lucas's number, but the words were unmistakably Sabrina's. "Testify against your mother and you'll never see your father again. Think carefully about whose side you're on. Family forgives. The court doesn't." I watched Amelia's face as she processed the threat. I expected fear, perhaps tears, maybe even wavering. Instead, I saw something harden in her eyes, the same steel I had glimpsed in Helen when she faced down contractors who tried to cut corners on her charity projects. "She thinks she can scare me," Amelia said quietly. "She's been scaring people her whole life. That's the only power she has." She took the phone back, captured a screenshot, and forwarded it to Julian. "Now it's evidence. Let her explain that to a judge." The night before trial, I could not sleep. I stood at the motel window, watching the empty parking lot, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Helen's foresight, Marjorie's patience, Gloria's courage, Amelia's steadfastness. All of these threads, woven together across years and decades, converging on a single courtroom where the truth would finally be spoken aloud. My phone buzzed with a message from Marjorie. "Thought you'd want to see this." Attached was a photograph, taken from her car, showing the courthouse parking lot. In the image, illuminated by a distant streetlight, sat Lucas's vehicle. He was alone in the driver's seat, his face partially visible through the window. He was holding something small in his hands. Even in the grainy photograph, I recognized the shape. A USB drive. I zoomed in on his face, searching for some indication of his intentions. His hands were visibly shaking. His expression was that of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to step forward or back. He had been sitting there for what looked like hours, wrestling with whatever war was raging inside him. Tomorrow, the trial would begin. Tomorrow, we would present our evidence, call our witnesses, and ask a judge to see what we had seen. But tonight, my son sat alone in the dark, holding the power to change everything. He had one night to decide who he wanted to be. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, more intimate. Wooden benches lined the gallery like church pews, and pale morning light filtered through tall windows that had not been cleaned in years. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Julian, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. Amelia sat directly behind me in the first row of the gallery, her face composed but her eyes bright with barely contained emotion. Marjorie had taken a seat near the back, watching everything with the patient attention of someone who had waited 20 years for this day. Sabrina entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, and I understood immediately why she had never lost before. She had transformed herself completely. Gone was the predator I had glimpsed in my kitchen, the woman who had held my inhaler just out of reach while I suffocated. In her place stood a vision of wounded innocence, soft lavender dress, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a simple style that made her look younger, more vulnerable. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she walked to the defense table, leaning on Victor Ashworth's arm as though she might collapse without support. The performance was masterful. If I had not lived through her cruelty myself, I might have believed it. Ashworth wasted no time establishing his narrative. In his opening statement, he painted a picture of a devoted daughter-in-law caught in an impossible situation caring for an elderly father-in-law whose mental decline had made him paranoid and accusatory. "Mr. Vernier is a confused elderly man," Ashworth declared, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy, manipulated by outside parties with their own agendas. His neighbor, a woman with a documented grudge against Mrs. Vernier's family, his own granddaughter, a troubled teenager acting out against her parents' reasonable discipline. He gestured toward Sabrina, who lowered her eyes demurely. "My client has done nothing but try to help her family, and for that, she has been rewarded with false accusations and fabricated evidence." Julian rose for his response, with the calm confidence of a man holding better cards than his opponent knew. He did not attack Sabrina directly. Instead, he began with facts, the competency evaluation conducted by Dr. Patricia Webb, the 90 minutes of cognitive testing, the written conclusion that I was sharper than most people half his age. He submitted the full medical records, documentation from my primary care physician confirming no history of cognitive decline, no diagnosis of dementia, no evidence whatsoever to support the claim that I was confused or manipulable. "Mr. Vernier is not a confused old man," Julian said quietly. "He is a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years designing buildings that still stand today. He is a widower who lost his wife to cancer and has been grieving alone while the woman who should have supported him instead plotted to steal his home, his savings, and his autonomy." He paused, letting the words settle over the courtroom like dust after a demolition. "And we can prove it." The first video played on a large screen, positioned where both the judge and the gallery could see it clearly. The kitchen, the night of my asthma attack. The footage was crystal clear, captured by Helen's hidden camera, with a quality that left no room for claims of ambiguity. I watched myself stumble against the counter, watched the glass shatter, watched my desperate struggle for breath. And then Sabrina entered the frame. The courtroom went absolutely silent. I could hear the soft whir of the ventilation system, the creak of someone shifting in their seat. On screen, Sabrina picked up my inhaler and held it just beyond my reach, her smile visible even in the dim kitchen light. "Breathe, old man," her recorded voice said, clear as a bell. "Show me how badly you want it." The footage showed her watch me gasp for 47 seconds. I had counted them before, but counting them again in this room, surrounded by witnesses, made each one feel like an eternity before finally tossing the inhaler at my feet. Ashworth was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This footage is clearly edited, manipulated to present a false narrative. We have no way to verify its authenticity." The judge, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and no tolerance for theatrics, looked at him over her glasses. "The footage has been authenticated by a certified forensic video analyst whose report is included in the plaintiff's evidence submission." Objection overruled. She turned to the screen. "Continue." Sabrina's composure had begun to crack. I could see it in the tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the defense table. She had expected the footage to be destroyed. She had personally smashed every camera, every hard drive. How could it still exist? And then the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. A woman stood in the entrance, small and frail, her white hair thin and her shoulders hunched with age and fear. She wore a simple gray dress and clutched a worn handbag with both hands, as though it were the only anchor keeping her from floating away. She looked nothing like Sabrina, and yet, watching them both in the same room, the resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, mother and daughter, separated by decades and cruelty. Gloria Coletti had come to testify. Sabrina's face went white. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. "Your Honor," Julian announced, rising from his seat, "the plaintiff would like to call Gloria Coletti, the defendant's mother, as a witness." Gloria walked to the stand with slow, deliberate steps, each one costing her visible effort. When she was sworn in and seated, she looked at Sabrina for a long moment, looked at her the way a survivor looks at the site of their trauma, and then turned to face the judge. Julian's questions were gentle, almost tender. He asked about Gloria's relationship with her daughter, about the years they had lived together, about what had changed, and Gloria told the truth. She described 10 years of escalating abuse, medication withheld when she failed to comply with Sabrina's demands, money taken from her accounts without permission, isolation from friends and family who might have helped, threats explicit and implicit that kept her silent even when she knew what was happening was wrong. "My daughter," Gloria said, her voice breaking but her words clear, "is doing to this man exactly what she did to me. I filed a complaint once, 10 years ago, but I withdrew it because I was afraid. Because she convinced me that no one would believe me, that I would die alone if I turned against my own child." Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. I was too afraid to stop her then. "I won't be silent now." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I looked at Sabrina and saw something I had never seen on her face before, not fear, but rage. Raw, uncontrolled rage. She moved before anyone could stop her. She lunged toward the witness stand, her carefully constructed image shattering in an instant. "You're lying," she screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "You ungrateful, senile, old—" Court security intercepted her before she reached Gloria. 2 officers restrained her, pulling her back toward the defense table while she continued to scream accusations and threats. Ashworth tried to calm her, but she shoved him away. The judge banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This court is in recess," the judge declared. "Counsel, control your client. We will resume in 30 minutes. They dragged Sabrina through a side door, her screams echoing down the hallway until they faded into muffled silence. The gallery erupted in murmurs, shocked whispers spreading like ripples in disturbed water. I looked at Julian, who met my eyes with the faintest hint of a smile. The damage was done. Whatever story Sabrina had tried to tell, whatever image she had tried to project, it had shattered beyond repair the moment she lunged for her own mother in open court. The judge had seen her true face, and we were only getting started. The 30-minute recess stretched into an hour. When court finally resumed, Sabrina had been restored to something resembling composure, though the cracks in her facade were now visible to everyone. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements stiff and controlled, her earlier performance of wounded innocence replaced by something harder and more desperate. Ashworth had clearly spent the recess coaching her, because she kept her hands folded in her lap and her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at anyone, least of all her mother, who had returned to a seat in the gallery with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally spoken their truth. Ashworth rose immediately to address Gloria's testimony. "Your Honor, we must consider the source of these allegations. Mrs. Gloria Coletti is a woman of advanced age with documented health issues. Her perception of events may be colored by confusion, by resentment, by the natural deterioration that comes with aging." He spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "My client has done nothing but care for her mother, and this is how she's repaid with wild accusations in a public courtroom. We ask that Mrs. Coletti's testimony be viewed with appropriate skepticism." Julian did not rise to argue. He simply waited for Ashworth to finish, then stood with the unhurried confidence of a man about to play his strongest card. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "if opposing counsel finds the testimony of an elderly woman unreliable, then perhaps the court would prefer evidence from someone younger, someone who witnessed the defendant's behavior firsthand, in real time, over a period of months." He turned toward the gallery. "The plaintiff calls Amelia Vernier to the stand." I watched my granddaughter rise from her seat and walk toward the witness stand. She was 16 years old, dressed simply in a dark blue dress that made her look older than her years. Her face was pale but composed, her step steady, her chin lifted with a determination that reminded me so powerfully of Helen that my heart ached. She had chosen this. She had gathered the evidence, made the recordings, and now she was prepared to testify against her own mother in open court. Whatever happened next, I had never been more proud of anyone in my life. The oath was administered. Amelia sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at Julian with clear, unwavering eyes. "Miss Vernier," Julian began gently, "can you tell the court what prompted you to begin recording conversations in your home?" Amelia nodded. "About 6 months ago, I overheard my mother on the phone with my grandmother, Gloria Coletti. My grandmother was crying. She was begging my mother to give back her medication. She kept saying please over and over. My mother just told her to stop calling and hung up. She paused, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she was describing. That's when I knew something was wrong. That's when I started recording." "And how many recordings do you have?" 12, Amelia said. 12 separate conversations over 6 months. I can play them all. The recordings were submitted into evidence one by one. Julian had organized them chronologically, each one time-stamped and authenticated by a forensic audio specialist. Virginia's one-party consent law meant that Amelia, as a participant in the household where the conversations occurred, had every legal right to record without anyone else's knowledge. Ashworth objected repeatedly to the authenticity, to the relevance, to the admissibility, but the judge overruled him each time. The law was clear, the evidence was valid, and the evidence was devastating. The first recording captured Sabrina coaching Lucas on what to say if anyone asked about my condition. "Just tell them he's confused," her voice instructed. "Forgetful. Say he gets lost in the house sometimes. People expect old men to decline. Give them what they expect." The second documented Sabrina calculating my assets with cold precision, the house's value, my pension, my savings accounts, the life insurance policy Helen had left behind. "Once I'm guardian, I can liquidate everything," she said. "He won't need it. And no one will question a devoted daughter-in-law managing her father-in-law's affairs." The third was a phone call to Gloria, Sabrina's voice sharp and threatening. "If you say one word to anyone about what happened, I will make sure you spend your last years in a state facility. Do you understand me? Not one word." The fourth detailed the guardianship scheme dates, timelines, which doctor she planned to bribe for a favorable assessment. "The emergency petition is the key," Sabrina explained to someone off mic. "Once the court declares him incompetent, everything else falls into place." Each recording landed like a hammer blow. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Sabrina's own voice condemned her, word by word, scheme by scheme. I watched the judge's face as she listened, watched the professional neutrality give way to something harder and more personal. She had presided over countless cases, heard countless lies, but this was something different, a daughter exploiting her own mother, a woman systematically dismantling an old man's life for financial gain. When the final recording ended, Ashworth rose for cross-examination. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the desperate aggression of a lawyer who knows he is losing. "Miss Vernier," he said, his tone sharp, "isn't it true that you have a troubled relationship with your mother? That you've been rebellious, defiant, difficult?" Amelia met his gaze without flinching. "I've been paying attention. Some people call that difficult." "Isn't it possible," Ashworth pressed, "that these recordings have been taken out of context? That a child angry at her mother might interpret innocent conversations as something sinister?" "The recordings speak for themselves," Amelia said calmly. "Context doesn't change what she said." "You've turned against your own mother," Ashworth said, his voice rising. "A child turned against the woman who raised her, who fed her, who—" "I'm not against my mother," Amelia interrupted, her voice cutting through his rhetoric like a blade. "I'm for the truth. Those aren't the same thing." The courtroom fell silent. Ashworth stood frozen, his mouth open, no response forthcoming. After a long moment, he returned to his seat without another word. The judge shuffled her papers, preparing to speak. I could see the conclusion forming on her face, the weight of evidence, the collapse of Sabrina's defense, the clear path toward judgment. She opened her mouth to address the court, and then Lucas stood up. He rose from his seat in the back of the gallery, his face pale and haggard, his hands visibly trembling. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. Sabrina's expression shifted from defeat to confusion, to something approaching hope. Perhaps she thought he had come to defend her, to offer some last-minute salvation. But when Lucas spoke, his voice cracking with emotion, his words were not for her. "Your Honor," he said, "I have additional evidence." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Lucas walked toward the bench. Sabrina half rose from her seat, her face cycling through confusion, hope, and then as she saw the USB drive in his trembling hand, dawning horror. She knew what he was carrying. Perhaps she had always known. "Your Honor," Lucas said, his voice raw but steady, "I need to submit this evidence. I should have done it years ago." The judge studied him with sharp eyes. "You understand that any evidence submitted now will become part of the official record? That you may be asked to testify under oath about its contents?" "Yes, Your Honor." Lucas did not look at Sabrina. He could not. "I understand." He handed the USB drive to the bailiff, who passed it to Julian for review. As Julian connected it to the courtroom's display system, Lucas remained standing, as if sitting down would somehow diminish what he was about to say. "I've been keeping copies of everything for 3 years," he said, his words falling into the silent courtroom like stones into still water. "Every video from the camera system, every financial document, every email." He swallowed hard. "I told myself it was insurance, in case I ever needed to divorce her, in case I needed leverage." His voice cracked. "But the truth is, I was a coward. I watched her hurt my father. I watched her manipulate my daughter. I watched her destroy everything good in my family. And I did nothing. Because I was afraid of her. Because it was easier to pretend I didn't see." He finally turned to look at me, and I saw my son truly saw him for the first time in years. The fear was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes. But beneath it was something else: shame, grief, and the first fragile stirrings of the man he might have been if he had chosen differently. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I could not speak. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. The USB drive's contents appeared on the courtroom screen. Julian walked the judge through each file methodically. Backup copies of all the camera footage, independently time-stamped and verified. Sabrina's financial records, showing not just the $200,000 debt but the chain of desperate borrowing that had led to it: payday loans, credit card advances, and finally, communications with private lenders whose terms made loan sharks seem charitable. Emails planning the guardianship fraud in explicit detail, including a message to a corrupt physician offering $5,000 for a falsified cognitive assessment. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and impossible to dispute. Sabrina had documented her own crimes with the meticulousness of someone who never imagined being caught. But Julian was not finished. "Your Honor," he said, reaching into his briefcase, "there is one final piece of evidence. The plaintiff's late wife, Helen Vernier, left this envelope with instructions that it be opened only in a court of law." He held up the second envelope, the one I had carried with me since finding it in Helen's desk, the one I had resisted opening despite every temptation. "With the court's permission, I would like to submit its contents." The judge nodded. Julian opened the envelope and removed a small USB drive, different from the others. He connected it to the system, and the screen flickered to life. Helen appeared on screen, and my heart stopped. She was sitting in our living room, in the chair by the window where she had spent so many afternoons reading. The video was dated 18 months before her death. She was already thin, already pale, but her eyes burned with the fierce determination I had loved for 50 years. Behind her, barely visible at the edge of the frame, stood Sabrina. "I know what you are," Helen said, her voice steady despite her frailty. "I know what you did to your mother. I've seen the records, Sabrina. I've talked to people who remember. And I'm telling you now, if you ever hurt my husband, I will make sure the world knows exactly who you are. Every scheme, every victim, everything." Sabrina's recorded voice was cold, contemptuous. "You'll be dead before you can do anything, old woman. You're barely alive now. Who's going to believe a dying woman's accusations?" Helen smiled a small, sad, triumphant smile. "I don't need to be alive, Sabrina. I just need to be prepared." The video ended. The courtroom sat in absolute silence. The judge removed her glasses and set them on the bench with deliberate precision. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "I have seen enough." She turned to address a woman seated in the front row of the gallery, a woman I had noticed earlier but not recognized. "Miss Patterson, I believe the district attorney's office will want to proceed." The woman rose, her face grim. "Your Honor, based on the evidence presented today, the Commonwealth of Virginia is filing criminal charges against Sabrina Coletti Vernier. Elder abuse, financial fraud, criminal conspiracy." She nodded to the court security officers stationed by the doors. "We request immediate detention." The officers moved forward. Sabrina's composure finally shattered completely. She tried to stand, tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. They took her arms, secured the handcuffs, and began leading her toward the side door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned. Her eyes found mine across the courtroom, and for the first time since I had known her, there was no mask, no performance, no calculated manipulation, just raw, animal fear. I held her gaze and said nothing. I did not need to. Helen had said everything that needed to be said. The days following the trial passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet exhaustion. Sabrina remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. Ashworth had withdrawn as her attorney, citing irreconcilable differences, and she was now represented by a public defender who seemed as overwhelmed by the evidence as everyone else. The case would take months to work through the criminal justice system, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. She would be held accountable. After a lifetime of escaping consequences, Sabrina Coletti-Vernier had finally met a wall she could not charm or manipulate her way through. Julian called me to his office 3 days after the verdict. When I arrived, he was standing by his window, holding a folder that looked different from the legal documents I had grown accustomed to seeing, older, more worn, as if it had been waiting in a drawer for years. "There's one more thing Helen left," he said quietly. "Something she asked me to reveal only after the trial concluded." He handed me the folder. Inside was documentation for a trust fund I had never known existed. Helen had established it 5 years ago, funded through careful investments and the sale of properties I had not realized she owned. The trust was specifically designed to protect me if I was ever, in her words, targeted by those who should have loved him. The amount was substantial enough for me to live independently for the rest of my life, with a separate provision set aside for Amelia's college education. "She thought of everything," Julian said. "She knew she might not be here to protect you herself. So she built a fortress out of paper and planning, and she trusted me to hand you the keys when the time came." I could not speak. I sat in Julian's office, holding the evidence of my wife's love, and wept. That evening, alone in the motel room, I watched Helen's final video. It was different from the one played in court. This was personal, intimate, meant only for me. She sat in the same chair by the window, but her expression was softer, her eyes filled with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "My love," she said, "if you're seeing this, it means I couldn't protect you in person. So I protected you the only way I could, with evidence, with planning, with everything I had." She paused, and I saw tears glisten in her eyes. "Don't mourn me forever, August. Live for both of us. See the places we dreamed of seeing. Laugh at the jokes I'll never hear. And remember what I always told you, kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. I loved you enough to give you boundaries." I watched the video 3 times, memorizing every word, every gesture, every flicker of expression on her face. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, letting her presence fill the empty spaces of the room. Marjorie came the next morning, carrying a small wrapped package. When I opened it, I found a framed photograph I had never seen before, her late husband Frank, decades younger, standing next to a man I barely recognized as myself at some long-forgotten community event. We were both smiling, caught in a moment of casual friendship I could not recall. "Your wife reached out to me 2 years ago," Marjorie said softly. "She had researched my history with the Coletti family. She knew what Diane had done to me, and she suspected what Sabrina might do to you." She touched the frame gently. "Helen asked me to watch over you, to be ready if you ever needed help. Everything I did moving next door, keeping vigil, recording that night, I did because Helen asked me to. I owed her nothing, but she convinced me that protecting you was a way of honoring Frank's memory. She was a remarkable woman, Mr. Vernier." "Yes," I said, my voice rough. "She was." Lucas arrived that evening, unannounced, standing in the motel parking lot as if afraid to approach the door. When I opened it, he looked worse than I had ever seen him, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his clothes wrinkled as though he had slept in them for days. He did not try to explain or justify. He did not ask for forgiveness. "I want to be your son again," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve it. I know that. But I want to try. I want to earn it back, if you'll let me." I looked at him for a long moment, at the boy I had raised, the man he had become, the father he might still learn to be. The anger was still there, buried deep, but beneath it was something stronger, something that Helen had taught me through 50 years of marriage. I opened the door wider and stepped aside. Julian came by the following afternoon with one final delivery. He placed a set of keys in my palm, old keys, brass, worn smooth by years of handling. "Helen bought a property 3 years ago," he said, "a cabin on a lake in the Virginia mountains. She told me it was where she wanted to grow old with you." He smiled sadly. She never got the chance, but she made sure it would be waiting for you whenever you were ready. I closed my fingers around the keys and felt their weight, the weight of Helen's love, still reaching out to me from beyond the grave. It's been waiting for you this whole time. The cabin was everything Helen had promised and more. It sat at the edge of a quiet lake in the Virginia mountains, surrounded by towering pines that whispered in the wind and reflected perfectly in the still water below. A wraparound porch faced west, positioned to catch every sunset. Inside, the rooms were simple but warm wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, windows that let the light pour in from every angle. Helen had furnished it herself, Julian told me. She had driven up here on weekends when I thought she was visiting her sister, hanging curtains and arranging furniture and making sure everything would be ready for the day I finally arrived. That day came 3 months after the trial. 3 months of paperwork and healing and learning to breathe without looking over my shoulder. 3 months of slowly accepting that the nightmare was truly over. Sabrina received her sentence on a gray Tuesday morning, 8 years for elder abuse, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. I did not attend the hearing. I had seen enough of courtrooms to last a lifetime. But Julian called me afterward, his voice carrying a quiet satisfaction. "It's done," he said. "She'll serve at least 5 years before parole eligibility, and the civil judgments will follow her for the rest of her life." Gloria came to visit me at the cabin a few weeks later. She looked different than she had at the trial, stronger somehow, despite her frailty. We sat on the porch together, watching the afternoon light play across the water, and she told me things about her daughter I had never known, the early signs she had ignored, the excuses she had made, the years she had spent blaming herself for raising a monster. "I didn't come to apologize," she said finally. "I came to thank you. I spent 10 years being my daughter's victim, too afraid to speak, too ashamed to ask for help." She turned to look at me, her eyes bright with tears that did not fall. "You gave me the courage to finally tell the truth. You helped me stop being a victim and start being a survivor." I took her hand, this woman who had suffered so much, who had been broken and silenced by her own child, and we sat together in comfortable silence until the sun began to set. Lucas comes every weekend now, usually with Amelia in tow. The relationship between us is fragile, built on small moments rather than grand gestures. He filed for divorce the week after the trial and started therapy shortly after. He does not make excuses for what he did. He does not ask for forgiveness he has not earned. Instead, he shows up. He helps me repair the dock, replace the screens on the porch, stack firewood for winter. He listens more than he speaks. And slowly, painfully, he is becoming someone I recognize again, not the frightened man who stood frozen in doorways, but the son I raised, finding his way back to himself. Amelia has blossomed in ways I never expected. She visits every weekend with her father, but she also calls during the week just to talk. She has applied to college's pre-law programs, every one of them. When I asked her why, she smiled with a determination that reminded me so powerfully of Helen that my breath caught in my throat. "Someone has to protect people like you and Grandma Gloria," she said. "Someone has to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." On a quiet evening in late autumn, I carry Helen's last letter down to the dock and sit watching the sun descend toward the mountains. The lake is perfectly still, a mirror reflecting the sky's slow transformation from blue to gold to deepening rose. I unfold the letter carefully, though I have memorized every word by now. "My darling August," I read aloud, my voice soft against the silence. "If you're reading this, I was right about her, but I was also right about you. You are stronger than you know, kinder than the world deserves, and more loved than you will ever understand." I fold the letter and press it against my heart. The last light of day catches the water, turning it from gold to silver, and I feel Helen's presence all around me in the cabin she prepared, the legacy she left, the life she made possible. "You were right about everything," I whisper to her, to the sky, to the quiet mountains standing witness. "I'm still standing, I'm still breathing. For both of us." The water catches the last light of day, turning gold then silver, and for the first time in years, August Vernier feels something he thought he had lost forever: peace. And so ends the story of August Vernier, a man who discovered that the greatest battles are not fought with fists or fury, but with patience, truth, and the quiet courage to stand up when everything seems lost. He faced betrayal from those who should have protected him, cruelty from someone who should have loved him, and silence from a son too afraid to choose sides. Yet he never surrendered his dignity. He never abandoned his principles. And in the end, he found what so many of us spend our entire lives searching for: peace. This story reminds us that it is never too late to fight for ourselves, that age does not diminish our worth, and that the people who truly love us will find ways to protect us even when they are no longer here. Helen's legacy was not just cameras and evidence. It was love transformed into action, reaching across the boundaries of life and death to shelter the man she cherished. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a situation where someone you trusted turned against you? How did you find the strength to stand up for yourself? What would you have done in August's place? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be the encouragement someone else needs to hear today. If you believe that stories like this matter, that voices like August deserve to be heard, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who needs to know they are not alone, because no one should ever have to fight for their dignity in silence. Thank you for listening until the very end. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the elders you love.